I guess my story, I was sexually assaulted multiple times actually on my college campus in sort of different aspects, and the stories are a little bit different, so I'll just tell a little bit about sort of each story. So the first time that I was sexually assaulted was my sophomore year of college. Went to a party with my friends, and this club organization on my campus was definitely notorious for having really strong drinks, and I sort of knew that. And basically one of my last memories of that night, the night is kind of choppy, but one of my last memories is this senior guy that I'd seen around campus a couple of times handing me a shot, and I hadn't seen it poured. And I always know, like, when you go to college, it's one of the first things that your mom tells you or a friend tells you or somebody tells you is to always make sure you see your drink being poured and it's from a central source, and all these sort of rules that we teach each other to keep each other safe. I didn't see it poured, and he handed it to me, and I just took it. And then within about the next 10 minutes, I kept drinking other things, so I wasn't really sure, and I still don't know if I was drugged or not. Yeah, so basically that night, like, the patches that I remember of it are feeling like not well and stuff, and I guess I sort of browned out, whatever that terminology is, because I remember the guy who poured me the shot at the beginning of the night when I first got to the party. I remember just seeing him sort of like watching me from across the room, and then he just came over. It was like he was just waiting for me to get drunk enough to take advantage, and I just remember that, like, it's sort of hazy, but I just remember that. And then I remember it was like a thing on my small college campus. We'd lock all our phones and our purses in somebody's room so they wouldn't get stolen. So I didn't have my campus swipe card to get back to my building, and I didn't have my phone. And he asked me if I wanted to get a breath of fresh air or something outside. And it was like sort of just one of those gray area things where I'm like, okay, well, yeah, I agreed to go back to somebody's room, but I didn't really want to. And then by the time I got there, I remember saying no, but then I blacked out. And then I came to a couple times, so I knew what was happening. And it was so confusing. I just pretended it was a hookup the next morning. I was completely like passed out in his bed, and I woke up in the morning, and I remember him looking sort of nervous or uncomfortable. And I woke up and I tried to play it cool. He was a senior guy, you know, and I didn't really understand what had happened to me. Like, I knew that I didn't want to, but I didn't know if I was so drunk that I didn't know if I properly communicated that to him, I guess. And then I since learned that if you're completely incapacitated, like, there's no way that you can possibly give consent. So I just went back to my dorm. One of those things that I kind of drove myself crazy with, like, you know, when you blame yourself after the fact, which is such a common reaction, is sort of like, well, can I definitely say it? No, I can't. You know, I didn't take any tests after. And I actually never reported that after it happened. I talked to one friend about it, but she had been sexually assaulted too, and neither of us really understood what it was, and we kind of convinced each other. It's like kind of a sad thing, because we kind of like convinced each other that we hadn't been, or that it was our fault. So we sort of talked to each other and said, like, are you gonna report? Like, no. Like, are you gonna report? No, I don't think so. Like, I'm still not sure that he knew what he was doing was wrong, which is like such a common thing I've heard. Like, you know, we want to give the abuser the benefit of the doubt at sort of like our own expense. So that was definitely a part of my experience. I barely saw him again on campus because he lived in a senior dorm that was further away on campus and stuff, and I pretty much just played it off cool, and I tried to forget about it. But it's one of those things that was really hard to forget about. It's like, even though I didn't know exactly what had happened to me, it made me very depressed after, but I couldn't really recognize there were so many different factors that were playing in all around the same time. And the guy graduated. I never turned him in for it. Kind of interesting because of what I ended up pulling together from my experiences. The first time I was sexually assaulted, I didn't understand that that's what had happened to me. And it actually took a emotionally abusive, sexually abusive relationship for about 6 to 7 months in my sophomore year, and it wasn't until after I'd left that abusive relationship that I fully understood what had happened. And that I was able to like name what had happened to me. So a few weeks after my sexual assault, I guess I would say I was probably at my most vulnerable that I'd been since I started college. So I just met this student that I'd never seen before. And my campus was a small campus. Like, people know everything about each other's business. So I hadn't met him before, and things progressed really quickly. He like pushed my boundaries really early on, and that was sort of a warning sign. It got to a point where I was just afraid every day, and I became afraid for my life. You're so tired because you're putting all of your energy into that person and taking care of them and making sure that they don't get mad at you and walking on eggshells and stuff. That's like you don't have any time left for yourself. It was my first serious relationship, so I feel like the biggest problem here was a lack of education, and that's why I'm such a proponent of like educating people at a younger age about domestic violence and intimate partner violence, is because all I knew about it was what I'd seen on TV. So when it happened to me, it took me a long time to recognize it. And we so often romanticize abusive behavior in our culture. You know, oh, he keeps calling you, that must mean he loves you, or he's reading your text messages and then yells at you because he loves you and because you were talking to another guy, but you're not supposed to hurt you if they love you. And so basically I called my mom, and I was absolutely exhausted, and I just called her. I told my boyfriend at the time, like, I'm gonna go home for the weekend, and I was sitting on the sofa with my mom, and I just sort of started talking to her, and I had a lot of support and a lot of resources that a lot of women and survivors of abuse don't have. So I was really lucky that when I told my mom, you know, about how mad he would get at me, or the things that he would call me, the times when I didn't want to have sex and he did it anyway, the times when, you know, my phone died or something, I was hanging out with a friend and he would just scream at me because he didn't know where I was and that kind of thing. And I was like, does that mean he cares? Like what does that mean, you know? And she didn't judge me, and I found out later on, she confided in me that she'd been in an abusive relationship when she was in college as well, and ended up being really triggering for her because she had never really gotten resources over it. But basically she took me to a women's crisis center in my town the next day, and somebody sat down with me and she showed me a diagram of that. Basically it was sort of like a pie chart, and it just said all these different forms of abusive behavior broken down into different subsections, and it had all these lists of does he do this, does he do that, you know, and it listed all these different potential red flags of controlling behavior or abusive relationships. And I circled about 95% of the things on the chart, and basically what they told me is that domestic violence is a cycle. So in some relationships it never gets to the point that somebody has to be physically violent, because oftentimes in abusive relationships the perpetrator will just try and control somebody by any means necessary. So it's sort of a thing that escalates. They're going to start with, you know, emotional or psychological manipulation, and then if that stops to work and the person starts fighting back, then it could turn physical. But basically I did get out of the relationship. You know, sexual violence is an international epidemic and an international problem that we're facing, and it's a community problem, and it's about people not talking about it, not bringing it up, and not feeling safe to, because they're going to be judged.